Morning, good afternoon, Professor Barry, Tom here. Moving into week number 4, sociology of deviance, an interesting subject area. FYI, if you're interested in this topic or just interested in sociology in general, we have SOC 211, sociology of deviance, maybe we offered once or twice a term or a year, academic calendar year. Highly recommend it. It's kind of taking the sociological approach, looking at things that are identified as how we think about deviance, things that are identified as deviance. Different than criminality, it's deviance and crime. Sometimes they overlap, but they're different things. Just provides a lot of interesting food for thought and critique and analysis of thinking about deviance. So that's kind of where we're off to today. Try to keep it, the 45 minutes went a little bit over last week, but that's all right. A lot to cover last week as well as this week. There's whole classes you can take in deviance, like I mentioned. So we're just going to be touching down, hitting some highlights, trying to kind of scratch the surface a little bit, beneath the surface, kind of talk about some different kind of things. First of all, we're going to define deviance. Deviance is a violation of a social norm. So, okay, that's the definition, but now we're going to get into all kinds of different questions. Well, how is a norm established? How is a norm influenced by history and culture and society? Who benefits from certain kind of norms versus other? Who can put social sanctions or social controls on norms? I mean, all these things become, things to investigate and to look at. When we think about deviance, we think about something as being bad. At least some of us do, and then that gets us into a value judgment. Somebody's making a declaration, or a declaration is being made that something had crossed a line and is not to be supported or is bad, or whatever word we want to use in that space. So that's a social process. Go back to social construction of reality, right? Nothing is inherently anything. It's we give things meaning, and certain things, like, well, thank goodness we give that meaning at this point in time in history. So it's not that it's bad that things are given meaning, but think about the process that things are given meaning, and kind of like sometimes we minimize taking it for granted. Go back to week 1, take a beginner's mind, the strange and the familiar, things that we kind of take for granted in the world around us, and sort of ask questions about them. So if we get into a value judgment, we're going to get into the social world. So we must look at something, okay, why is it that something is identified as being deviant or crossing the line? So that's what we're going to kind of get into, sociological perspective of deviance. So we're going to move away from like this sort of bad individuals kind of thing, like free will. And we're going to look at sort of interaction, self-determination, individual within environment, and also paying probably more attention to the environment and the context, and thinking about what's driving the patterns of human behavior. If we look back historically, Martin Luther King, we celebrate Martin Luther King today. See this as positive deviance. We may even use that term. In the South, Tennessee, Kentucky, South, Alabama, Mississippi, he was viewed as a during the time period, the 1950s, 1960s, when he was really involvement in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, really advocating for voting rights, for greater equity in the criminal justice system, educational system, movement towards desegregation of public facilities. I mean, all that kind of stuff. He's viewed as a communist, anti-American, un-American. So what's being defined as deviant at one time could shift over time, right? It's kind of relative. Vaping, depending on your age, depending on your gender, depending on your class, may have different meanings. If you are an exotic dancer and you're male or you're female, may have different kind of meanings. There was a case in Oregon versus Rideout, the first criminal case against someone who sexually assaulted their spouse, within a marital relationship. It was difficult. I mean, I guess rephrase that. So within a marriage, I mean, criminal filings and a violation of a crime was not pursued within a marital relationship. So somebody could commit sexual assault within a marital relationship, and historically was not something that was an issue with the criminal justice system. 1978, I think it was, criminal in Oregon versus Rideout was the first state where a husband was prosecuted for sexually assaulting his spouse. So definitions, meanings change. So if you look at Deviance and criminality. Deviance is a violation of a norm. Criminality is a violation of the law. So criminology, we don't necessarily talk about these terms, but criminology is more dedicated to almost like what are the background characteristics, the attributes that are influencing somebody to become or engage in criminality. Deviance is more about the meaning level, oftentimes, that we're kind of thinking about, although it's not always the case. We're going to talk about deviance. So deviance and criminality can overlap, but they're definitely distinct. You can speed between, if you're coming from Redmond or Prineville to Bend, and you're going 72 on 97, 65 is the posted speed limit, you get a speeding ticket. I mean, you're not deviant. You committed a crime, but you're not. It's a misdemeanor, but you're not. It's a moving violation, but you're it's not a crime. So different thing, and maybe that'll make more sense as further we go on of why we make that distinction. Well, the first thing look at deviance is looking at the act. What is being defined as being deviant and or criminal? What are the meanings attached to it? Social construction of reality. How does history and culture and social factors influence what is being defined as being deviant or criminal? So if we go to like prohibition from last week, prohibition, social construction of reality, wars on drugs, like what's the context of that? Things are being defined in a particular way. And historically, the United States has defined wars on drugs versus as a public health problem. Portugal was the first country to not only decriminalize, but legalize all substances. Different culture, different time period, different social setting, all these different kind of things. So it's like looking at the act, how are communities, cultures, societies defining what is being deviant or not. So it's taking the life of another, deviant or criminal. Well, it depends on the context. Depends on the situation, historical kind of context, and the situation itself. So for example, lynchings in the South. Lynchings in the South, people had, postcards, mementos from lynchings, mobs, is sort of Italian Americans, African Americans, others who were lynched in the South, and that the mob or the community that were at those events definitely didn't see it as either deviant or criminal. Another thing to think about with deviance is that it's not always voluntary. Somebody could be born with a deformity, some kind of deformity, and it's not like they voluntarily chose or did something to get them that status of being deviant. Other examples we can think about. Smoking and being able to buy tobacco age 21, making that sort of mark. That's arbitrary, like why 21? How's that moved across time? That's culture, history, all those different kind of things that are going on within that space. We could even move over into like, okay, smoking, a misdemeanor offense. What year was this? 2000. I don't know if that was like 2018, 2017. Where it's a misdemeanor in the state of Oregon now that if you're smoking aerosol and vaporizing a motor vehicle when a child is present, it's a misdemeanor. Like, okay, well, these things are being defined as being kind of a problem or a crime or whatever it may be. So how do we think about that? How do we think about how that came to be and all these different kind of things? Okay, so that's the act or behavior or the condition. Now we're going to move on to the actor is the other thing we look at. So the status, remember status from last week? We had ascribed status, the status you're born into, race and gender, part of an ascribed status. I think that's going to be the most relevant here, maybe master status as well. But the actor, so two people can engage in the same behavior, do the same thing, but their status can influence how it's perceived by the public or institutions and the response from those institutions or the public. So for example, in January 6th of 2022, what's been identified as the insurrection at the nation's capital, predominantly white males who breached the nation's capital. Hard to imagine, if you had people of color who are marching and protesting and who breached the nation's capital. I think we have to account for that the racial status of the actors makes a difference in terms of how the public support or denouncement or how the public responds, as well as institutions. In this case, the federal social control agents as well as state social control agents have responded to this event, as well as media, mass media, and journalism. Another example, the different standards for men and women in swearing. It's like two people use the F-bomb, but evaluated differently if a person's male or female. So that's the actor. Third part, we think about the setting. Well, so got first the act. How do we think about the social, cultural, historical environment? Why are things being defined as deviant or not, or criminal or not? Then we moved on to the actor. Okay, the status position of the actor sometimes makes a difference. Third factor is the setting sometimes makes a difference. Public displays of affection, it depends on the culture and the society. It depends on the time and the place. It depends on who it is, or that's more the actor, I guess, but it's the setting that's driving things. It could be a historical setting. So, for example, Oregon now supports the use of psilocybin for therapeutic reasons, at least at this point in time. So things are dependent upon context. And I'm thinking, just more context, place. Drinking in one setting may be appropriate, but not in another. So it's how does that physical setting change the evaluation judgment? And then the audience response. Deviance doesn't happen. This would be same, kind of like a crime, like the crime actually could be committed or deviance could be committed. But if there's no audience response, there's no reaction from the community. There's no identification that deviance actually happened. So that's the issue of audience response. One thing we look at is like, okay, what's the response from individuals, from groups, from society itself? So we think about social control. How are things being regulated? All the way from the micro level, the people that the person knows, all the way to the macro level, institutions and structure. So for deviance to occur, audience response has to be there. So I could engage in smoking methamphetamines in my own home. If no one knows, like secret deviance. If there's no audience response, it's all secret deviance. It doesn't become deviant until there's some stigmatization coming from an outside source. We could also go back to Mead and thinking about from last week and think about the generalized other. So Mead is the behaviorist. Thinking about we think before we act. We're aware of what the expectations of society are. So there could be some like form of deviance going on, even though there's no audience member present, audience response, but it's sort of this generalized other that's there where a sense of shame, stigmatization is going on, even though there may not be people there. But anyway, here's what we're looking at okay, well, how does the audience respond to that particular thing? Okay, now we're going to move into theories of deviance. There's quite a few, so I'm going to, again, just kind of touch down the surface. And hopefully you can, after going through these theories, kind of walk away, go, wow, man, you can think about deviance in so many different ways. Some theories are more applicable to certain types of deviance or crime. Some others, they're not intended to apply to every situation, every scenario. So it's not like there's one theory of deviance. It depends on there's just so many different factors to consider in each of these theories. Add something else to it. Some of them are more applicable to certain situations than others. Theories are grounded in research. These aren't just like personal opinions and ideas. They are supported by research over time. There's limitations and benefits of each theory. There's no one right theory. Some theories provide more support, more analysis for certain types of deviance and certain types of crime and not others. So there's no right and wrong, but I think the more we have more theories to use, the more we have a better understanding of, of things that are going on in the social world. And then we have something to draw on when we're looking at a particular thing, like, okay, let me think about it through that lens or from that theoretical perspective. The first sociological theory of crime, so move it away from deviance, it's called social disorganization theory or social ecology theory. This is the first theory of criminality that's coming out of sociology, and it's social disorganization. It's like, how is the community structured? And a community can be structured in a way that's disorganized and that's facilitating, increasing the likelihood of crime going on within those communities. So we're moving away from bad individuals right now. It's like, okay, this facilitates empathy and humanizing people in those environments in which there's a lot of disorganization. So say, okay, there's crime levels are high in that part of the community. We're not saying to ourselves, bad people, bad people, bad people, but rather okay, what's going on in that way that community is being organized? People still need to be accountable and responsible for their actions, but let's think more methodically about how is it that that environment, that context is influencing criminal behavior, self-determination, right? So let's focus on the neighborhood, wider community organizations, and looking at their overall impact. Burgess and Parks, who came up with this theory, looked at basically like the inner city and then looked at zones. They call them zones outside of that. So the business district was right here. It's where economic activity, low levels of criminal activity, like, on street level kind of things. They weren't looking at like white collar crime, things that may have been going on inside the buildings themselves. So tells you a limitation of the theory right there. Zone number 2 is like this zone of transition, low homeownership rates. People are moving in and out, economic instability, higher poverty rates. It's in this zone where criminality, certain types of crime are much more prevalent. There's less social bonds and connections to people in the community. This is where you're going to find many more challenges going on in that zone. And then you get like the working class community, much more stable. People have home ownership. People are maybe live in ethnic enclaves, but there's a sense of community. So this is the idea that it's about the way the community is organized. So if we think about, we're going to use this term later on, we talk about class stratification, is that post-industrialism, so starting in the 1970s, let's just say 1970s, we moved from an industrial economy to post-industrial. Service-oriented jobs started replacing manufacturing jobs. Higher education required to get into more and more positions in society itself. A lot of jobs were leaving the inner city, those manufacturing factory jobs. We're moving into finance, industry, service-oriented jobs. So it had a real impact on a lot of cities, Baltimore, Chicago, LA, a lot of communities that had a real strong economic base that was built on manufacturing. A lot of change really fast, facilitated increased crime and other social problems in those communities. So it's trying to understand those broader social forces and how they impact communities and then ultimately people. Couple of things, couple of different resources. This book here, Nicholas Kristof, journalist, often writes in the New York Times. It's about his journey, his experience in Yamhill, Oregon, growing up there, and then going back years later. So he grew up there. There's struggle there. There's problems in that community, but there was an economic base in that community. There were jobs, employment. Fast forward 40, 50 years, basically went through a post-industrial experience, a lot of manufacturing. I think they had a rubber manufacturing jobs there in that community, as well as there was a working mill. The jobs left. People who could leave went to where more jobs were, like up in the greater Portland metro area. The people who got left behind created this sort of place where more, like, a lot of desperation, alcohol, drugs, poverty, certain types of crime, kind of a rise in that community. Is trying to understand that versus just going bad individual kind of analysis. Our Towns, HBO special, it's on HBO. You can look at some trailers, interesting kind of story of the photojournalist. Go around the United States. I can't remember how many communities they look at, 8 communities or something like that. Communities that reinvented themselves, that went through post-industrial experience, and then they reinvented themselves, developed a new economy. In Central Oregon or Bend is profiled in that film. The last city that's looked at, the old mill, right? When it was a working mill, there's factories, there's employment, there's a sector, those jobs go away. Central Oregon's had the economic kind of energy put behind service and industry that's been, the influence this sort of boom in Central Oregon, of course, not without its own kind of struggles, but strong economy, less, criminality, crime, poverty, those things like that are much lower. They're still here. We got to be sort of concerned about a lot of different kind of things for sure. But the community, there's a lot of organization, participation, meaning, connection going on within the community itself. Okay. So now let's move into labeling theory, which is labeling language. So you can think about social construction of reality here. We think about meaning. We think about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language and culture interactive. We view the world through the sense of language or lens of language. So labeling theory, the idea is nothing is deviant until it's labeled as such. Smoking a joint not deviant until it's labeled as deviant, right? We can see that over different time periods. Like the act of smoking could have occurred in 1920s, 1940s, 1960s, 1980s, 2000. Could be by someone of a certain age, certain race, certain gender. It's not deviant until it's labeled as being deviant. Sexual assault, go back to the beginning. It wasn't until 1978 the first criminal sanctions against someone who committed sexual assault within a marital relationship. So it's not deviant just because it's labeled until it's labeled as such. Labels vary with degrees of stigma. There's a lot of different degrees of stigma with that. Part of it is, that stigma that Cooley thinks about Looking Glass Self. Like, I imagine how you see me if I had a history of incarceration. I'm imagining how you might think of me of being someone who's been incarcerated. I got to deal with that stigma. Even, like me, the generalized other, knowing that society has a stigma, it kind of enters my headspace, right? Think about how do we manage stigma, this dramaturgy, how we demonstrate that we are not that anymore, or we're not part of that, or maybe, it's like there's a little dramaturgy in terms of performance. Labels, what labels do we use? Labels tell us about language and culture. Language, they reveal values and ideals. So that's Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sometimes labels become a master status. A person with struggling with a drug addiction, that's a master status. Deviance oftentimes can be a master status. Criminality for sure be a master status, where it's what people see. They organize a person's status positions, and that becomes the most important one. There's this powerful TED Talk by Brian Stevenson, talks about, in his kind of in a lot of his interviews, he talks about people are more than the worst thing they've ever done. So if a person who's stolen something, they're more than a thief. And he goes through this kind of like all these different kinds of crimes. And I think it's pretty powerful, right? So he's addressing this master status sort of thing. Like if we as a culture and a society and as a judicial system, we just see that person as a thief. We don't see them as being a person who committed robbery, and also they are also these other things. It's more humanizing. It's pretty powerful, right? It takes away a little bit of that master status, which could a lot of stigma, and it can have an influence on how people see that individual. Language, labels, and culture are interactive. We get it into societal reaction perspective. Lemur, primary, secondary, tertiary deviance. Basically, it's looking at the label and the influence of the label. I'll leave it up to you to read the chapter on that, but it's looking at like, what is the influence of the label? Labels have an influence on potential influence on people's identity and experience. So let's think about the label. We could look at different kinds of examples, historical examples. Look at the gay rights movement. It started in 1969, Stonewall in New York. It started. There was movements going on in the 1950s before that, but that was sort of a very significant event that sparked larger discussions and advocacy at a larger level and support for injustices that were related to suppression of the LGBTQ community. Move to 2015, where Supreme Court recognizes same-sex marriages. So the level of labeling, so the level of stigma has declined over time. And we can see this in these two cases as well, that there's still some opposition, but there's been a significant shift. More people are in favor of same-sex marriage. Look where this is interesting to me, where this is 2004, where Democrats polled or where Republicans are polling today. So things change, right? Labeling meaning changes over time. Think about the impact of labels on people's and their mental health. Individuals who identify as transgender experience significant higher rates of suicide ideation, thoughts of suicide, as well as committing suicide. Go back to sociology, the power of sociology. Like, okay, let's try to understand that. Like, okay, that demographic, individuals who are transgender have that experience. Let's think about that. Like, why is it that way? Part of it's related to stigmatization and exclusion and these different elements. That's about society and culture and social control. That's shaping and driving that outcome. So let's be mindful and think about those kind of things. Third theory of deviance, I'm just going to bypass this because for time, purposes, or maybe I'll just like mention real quick, because I think there's an interesting history. The idea here is that deviance can be sometimes taken over by the experts, whether that's medical professionals, psychiatric, or psychology, social work, that it gets medicalized. And a lot of different institutions may be involved in that medicalization process. So I don't know, you could look at, I'll give you a couple different examples, but there's it's this interesting relationship between science. Like, we want to use science to be able to understand things better. This would be let's say psychology, psychiatry, social work, using research to drive and understand, but sometimes the experts are actually creating the deviance or facilitating that themselves because they're medicalizing it. They're taking it and moving it. So for example, here, in looking at gender and gender identity and transgender, we could get to where we medicalize that and see that as an individual medicalized problem versus as a social force problem or something that's going on in the larger environment. So there's mass institutionalization of the mentally ill in the United States until the 1950s, 60s started to be critiqued in significant ways. So if you ever heard of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a book written by Ken Kesey, there's this anti-psychiatry movement that was going on in the 1960s, 1970s that challenged the field of psychiatry, said that psychiatry is overextending their power. And it's getting to where psychiatry becomes a social control agent, and we're missing the opportunity to talk about the underlying social issues that are going on. So it's trying to keep like a checks and balances kind of thing, keeping things in place. I don't know. I brought this up to say maybe this is the act. It was the 1800s. This is an interesting, I don't know if you're interested in history and history of kind of this kind of stuff. The discovery of the asylum by Rotham is really interesting. It's about the building of institutions and building of all these different kind of things where we're defining not only the problems and the issues, but creating institutions to be there to help alleviate society from the burden of the individuals who are acting and doing certain things, acting in certain ways and doing certain things. Oregon State Insane Asylum, 1883. So, then I mentioned there's been a challenge to the field of psychiatry starting in the 1970s. So, here's an example like medicalization. So, okay, controversial disorder, gender identity disorder. It's like, okay, gender dysphoria, a person whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. Some people who are transgender experience gender dysphoria, psychological distress that results from this incongruence. So the question to raise is that psychological distress, isn't that coming, to what degree is that coming because of the stigma from society itself, the exclusion and the stigma? So it's not that the individual, because they have a different gender, their biological self and their gender doesn't match, like in a cisgender individual. This isn't gender dysphoria kind of pathologizes or medicalizes, but at the same time, it recognizes that there's a struggle point going on. So this becomes like a way of like, how do we use evidence and information and data without pathologizing further and stigmatizing further individuals who are experiencing certain things? 1973 was the year that the APA, American Psychiatric Association, voted to remove homosexuality as that was their language, the language of culture at the time, that labeling theory, right? Stuff. So 1973 removed homosexuality as a diagnosable disorder. 1974, it appeared in the new DSM in 1974, is no longer part of that DSM. Labels change. Want to also let you know that, one more, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD. A lot of controversy came about with this particular this identification. Is this pharmaceutical companies are creating disorders because now they can have a pharmaceutical to be able to, sell a pharmaceutical for a particular problem issue? Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, very clinical. I'm thinking about McDonaldization, right? We could apply that principle to some of the stuff as well. The idea of anti-psychiatry, I don't know. That time period, as I mentioned, 1970s, Thomas Sawes was a person, Rosenhan another one, who were pretty powerful forces in critiquing the system of psychiatry. this is, I think, a compelling argument or perspective. Thomas Szasz did not deny that things like schizophrenia, things that are biological, neurological conditions existed. The issue that he raised is that these are biological, neurological conditions and should be defined as biological, neurological, not in the field of psychiatry. And everything else he said are problems in life. It's not, if it's not neurological, that's due, like if a depression's not due to like, let's say a thyroid or other chemical, like a neurological, I don't like the word imbalance, but neurological levels are different, or hormonal and other levels are different, are creating some of those emotional impacts. Those are problems, and those are neurological and should be identified as medical problems, not psychiatric problems. And he said everything else are just problems in living. So it's this kind of critique of the model. And I just want to let you know too that there are services that are available. We have CAP services here on campus. So man, it's a great resources. Sometimes having a life coach, somebody to be there by your side, you're going through some personal struggle, there can be great value in having a life coach. Or someone there to be a counselor to be able to provide support and direction. So just be aware that you have those available to you as a student. Next theory is looking at conflict theory perspective. We're going to be addressing inequality, whether race, class, gender, sexual orientation, different inequalities, and how they get expressed through social control systems, whether at community level, individual level, or all the way into institutions. So all the way from definitions, we look at crime, definitions of what is criminal, to arrests, where do the biases and discrimination happen within that state of the process? How about processing? Each step in the process through the judicial system and criminal justice system has its own issues of inequalities that are going to come out in that space. Conflict theory is trying to identify them in order to create a more just system. So think about ideal culture and practice culture. In some way, you could look at conflict theory and go, conflict theory is really trying to get challenge, look at that practice culture, not to be nasty about it, but to address it so we can be more aligned with the cultural values that we want. So look at like the war on drugs, a lot of different issues with the war on drugs, a lot of different drugs. So, I mean, this is a war against people. Why is it a crime versus a public health problem? There's a class issue, there's a race issue with that. Why do we focus in the United States on retribution, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, like coming down harder on criminals versus more of a rehabilitation model? Whose interests are being served in that particular process? I think hegemony comes into play. Like Americans can be socialized into the idea that we need to get tougher on crime. And it distracts us from looking at the underlying conditions that are increasing the likelihood of certain types of crime. And then there's some issues. I won't go through these policies, but like stop and frisk that was eventually viewed as unconstitutional, where I think a lot of people supported it. It's like, well, these policies they were racial inequities that are built in these that later got viewed as being unconstitutional because of those discriminatory elements. All right, then there's functionalism. It has a sort of view that if it exists across time and place, it must have a function for the social system. Deviance exists in all societies. We need deviance for the survival of group and society itself. Deviance does certain things. So deviance helps to clarify what our values are, establishes a boundary between what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what is not. Sometimes deviance creates solidarity between us and them. Sometimes it promotes social change. Always the limitation of functionalism is going to be it doesn't address inequality and power. So if you look at, for example, sports athletes and protests, this, the function of these, when Kaepernick and kneeling before the start of the game, at the time of the national anthem, this was, I don't know how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and a lot of community conversations, is it okay and acceptable for athletes to protest? Under what conditions do we support or not support athletes engaging in protest? This is about identification of deviance. We're clarifying our values, our boundaries of what's right and what is wrong. This is the argument from a functionalist perspective. If we look at 1950s House of Un-American Activities Committee, the Red Scare, fear of communism, this committee gets formed where a lot of persecution of innocent individuals through the system. It was a time period of a lot of fear, and deviance served as a vehicle to create some stability, kind of some sense of order. Merton's theory is a functionalist theory. His view is that one way to look at the likelihood of deviance or crime in a community is looking at the relationship between the means to get somewhere and the goals within a society. So the cultural goal in the United States is the American dream: wealth, possession, ownership, status that goes along with that. Material wealth gives you more status. So our cultural goal is to get more and more of that, right? So if we're going to put so much focus on the cultural goal to give you status and to give you regard by the community and society at large, it's going to put a lot of pressure on communities that don't have the resources to be able to get to that space. So the cultural goal, if people have the cultural goal of the American dream and they accept the pathway to get there, the legitimate conventional means, work hard, go to school, get a college education, that's all conventional, they're conforming. Sometimes people innovate where they do something different. No, I want the cultural goal. I want the American dream. I don't have the same resources to get there. So I'm going to do things like engage in the illicit drug trade, become a drug dealer as a way to gain income and access to that material life. So that's the strain is between the goal and the mean. Every once in a while, what happens is collectively there can be society reorganizes things, and maybe the American dream gets challenged a little bit, and we start to rethink the American dream. I think we're doing that right now. Or there's rebellion going on, a social movement to increase the means, like looking at impoverished communities and say, okay, how can we structure things to give more opportunities within these communities? So that's kind of the idea there. And then we get into our interactionist theories. We get differential association, basically the idea that all criminal behavior is learned. We learned it in groups. Part of that learning depends on how important that group is to us and how intense we're involved in that group. Sutherland, who came up with this theory, he studied white-collar crime, and he realized that it's never the individual alone. That person has learned techniques, motives, ways to rationalize, justify by being around other individuals. So it's thinking about, if we look back at that social conformity and look back from last week, the social self, Sutherland is interested in that part. Like, how do people learn deviant behavior? There's an article somebody wrote back in the 60s, 70s called How to Become a Marijuana User. Howard Becker was a researcher. And it's kind of like, how do people become marijuana user? This was a time period way before legalization and of recreational marijuana. So it's like, how do people get part of that subculture? What makes people become a regular user? Sort of this process. And there's always a social kind of a thing. Think about sexual assault on college campuses, Greek life. There's an influence. Being part of that particular social group. 25% of sexual assault victims in one survey were sorority members. It's a risk factor. Fraternity men are 3 times more likely to commit rape than their or sexual assault than their non-Greek partners. So looking at, okay, what's going on in terms of the social learning part? What's going on in terms of the groups that people belong to? That's social, that's differential association. Social associating with another group. And then finally, social control theory of thinking about not why do people commit deviance and crime, but why not? The argument or perspective is that the more people are committed to, the more they're attached to conventional societies, so people who are kind of doing the normative thing, the more people are attached to conventional society, believe in it, have an opportunity in it, and they have a greater stake in conformity. It's kind of a compelling argument. I mean, I don't commit, I speak, I have certain misdemeanors like speeding, but I don't commit I'm not going to get into the likelihood of me getting into an assault with somebody else. Provocation is very limited. Not because I'm a better person would be what Hershey's argument is. Not because I'm a better person. I got greater stake in conformity. There's more risk. Like, why would if I did that, I lose a lot, both in terms of the ways in which my colleagues, peers, others, potentially, if it goes far enough, maybe my job and employment, my reputation among my family, other things. So the more stake in conformity, greater compliance. Pretty profound, huh? Where you start thinking about, what about if you grow up in a community where you just don't have a lot of stake in conformity? Humans are humans. I mean, how would we behave in a different environment where we're not in an environment that's encouraging or gives us a stake in conformity, like we're invested in it, that we have a lot to lose. But it can't answer all the questions. We get about this example here is somebody who's really wealthy that engages in criminal activity. You know, it's like, well, how do you explain that, right? Certain programs like locally Central Oregon Partnership for Youth of having mentors and having volunteers work with and be with youth whose parents are incarcerated. Trying to keep those kids connected and bonded to conventional society. I think this is a worthwhile video. I'd encourage checking it out. Norway has probably what's been identified as the most humane prison system in the world. I'm not saying that we could replicate that model or that we should, but just really interesting to see like a very significantly a cultural difference between the United States and Norway, and how different a prison system might operate, and then start to think about cultural values, hegemony, other different kind of things that shape the ways in which our system of incarceration developed over time. Like I said before at the start, SOC 211, Sociology of Deviance, if you're interested, it's a great class. I enjoy that a couple times a year. It's offered. Have a great day. Have a great rest of your week, and catch you next time.